Welcome to the feast. For this conversation, I sat down with another friend named Mike, who is currently working on his PhD in electrical engineering, and we talked about materialism and how to frame your conception of things in a way that makes materialism seem unintuitive, even if you're scientifically minded. I've been excited to have this podcast with him because we've both had times in our life where we've been deeply religious, and we've both had times where we've basically been agnostics and we've flip-flopped. And to us, what really breaks the cycle comes down to the concept of language. And so, we've talked about this before and kind of seemed to converge on that. And he was really the perfect guest for me, to have this podcast with. Unfortunately, right before we did the podcast, I had just worked a 12-hour shift and was pretty groggy going into it, and that's pretty obvious at the beginning. Also, this turned out to be a pretty abstract and winding conversation. So towards the end, I don't think I did quite the best job of really connecting all the dots and all the concepts that we talked about. So kind of what I want to do here at the beginning is to provide sort of an outline of our ideas in a condensed form. And I apologize in advance for this long intro, but I really do think it'll be a little bit of a roadmap for the conversation. And because it was kind of abstract and windy, I think this will be useful. So to kind of jump right into it about how might materialism be unintuitive, even if you're scientifically minded. Mike kind of has a two-pronged approach. First, there are multiple vocabularies, not just scientific vocabularies, that successfully convey meaning. And second, physics is just interested in how objects interact, which really makes it incapable of laying claim to bedrock reality. So the kind of three-paragraph explanation of what Mike is getting at is, all words are made up, right? I'll have an experience and I'll label it with a word or a symbol, and we just agree on the meaning so we can communicate experiences to each other. This is important because the words we use really just depend on the experience we want to convey, right? If I think I've found a new pattern in physical nature, I'll articulate a scientific hypothesis. If I'm depressed and if I want to communicate how that plays out in different social contexts, I'll write a play called Hamlet where the main character talks with ghosts. Right, so to Mike, it's just obvious that we kind of invent language games to convey meaning and experiences to one another. And there's nothing really about any given language game that has a particular stake to base reality, right? Because the purpose of language games is really to convey experiences, not to make fundamental claims about being itself. And it's just patently obvious to Mike that science, the arts, religious language, the ordinary vocabulary we socialize with, ethical language, and so on, all can successfully be used to communicate experiences. The only difference in really word choice, the only difference in the language game you happen to deploy is really just, it comes down to the kind of experience that you happen to want to convey and the context in which you want to convey it. So right from the beginning, Mike isn't going to assume for a second that physics is really the only language game that can successfully convey information. Even if it was, physics just describes what a scientist will experience in a lab with any given setup, which is not the same thing as having the trademark to reality. I'm kind of putting words in his mouth a bit there, but I think he'd agree more or less that to him, that's just what it means to not be a materialist, is to, deploy multiple language games for different contexts to convey different experiences. For me, I like to kind of hop into the driver's seat of the materialism car and try to crash it. To me, there's a sense in which physics itself isn't replicable, right? The idea is if you start at the bottom of the ladder of abstraction and then climb up and then climb back down, you might not end up where you started. What I mean by that is, think about a pyramid, kind of like the food pyramid, but it's upside down. And at the bottom is just a few particles which obey a few equations. And then above that, there are atoms which are built from these particles. And now there's many more kinds of atoms than their particles. So you need many more equations to describe them. They have much more complex diversity of behavior. And above the atoms are molecules, and again, there are many more molecules than there are atoms. And there's many more equations to describe all these molecules. And you keep going up, right? You go through materials and cells and organs and organisms and ultimately humans, which are, in a sense, the sort of highest level of complexity here. And now there's an interesting thing about being a human and about living up here in the space of highest complexity, right? It's so complex that there's so many different kinds of experiences you can have, right? And you're forced to use words which don't perfectly capture reality, but adequately capture your situation. For example, we have a category called tree, right? And let's say a new tree sprouts up in a forest somewhere and it grows up like every other tree. The problem is it's not like every other tree, right? It's in a different location, it has a different unique configuration of branches, right? It has a unique number of leaves, maybe the size, certainly the size, shape, and indent in every leaf is almost certainly a unique combination. Like truly, there is no other object in the universe like this tree, right? Yet we take one look at it and we just know to call it a tree. And so that's what I mean when I say language is clunky, right? We don't have a word for every recombination of atoms because that's impossible, right? Our world is too complex. But we need to move forward in a world that's that complex, right? It's so complex. Again, there's no two objects that are exactly the same down to each atom, but we can't have a unique concept and a unique word for every object, literally every object, right? So we're in the business, so humans are just naturally in the business of making some assumptions, coming up with categories, and then using that made up language to conceptualize the world in just a practical way. So any given set of useful assumptions about the world is indistinguishable from valid assumptions. So as long as I'm careful about the context, right? If a set of assumptions and if a certain way of talking about things is useful, it's just valid. As long as I'm careful about the context and if I'm on the same page with the people I'm communicating with, right? For example, I could assume that the universe is a bunch of interacting quantities, and that might bring me back down the physics ladder. Or I might want to assume that people have moral obligations in a different context, and that'll take me down the ethics ladder. And since the ethical assumptions are different from the physical assumptions, the principles we discover at the bottom of ethics are going to look nothing alike the principles we discover at the bottom of physics. And there's just no end to all the different ways of making assumptions and categories. We want to navigate physical nature and we want to navigate ethics, but we also want to navigate relationships and pursuing happiness and purpose and navigating emotions and socializing. So we're just naturally picking up any relevant set of experiences to make assumptions about. We're just naturally in the business of coming up with different abstraction ladders, right, for these different categories of experience. And it starts to look like, if you take that seriously, it almost starts to look like there's a richness to reality that's so much wider than materialism. It's so much bigger. Anyway, I think that kind of captures our ideas, our concepts, and the intuitions we've formed off that. Sorry for the long intro again. Hopefully that's just a good roadmap for the discussion ahead, and hope you enjoy. And looks like we're recording.
Awesome.
So I'm super excited to have this conversation. I was kind of looking forward to this all week ever since we kind of started texting about it. I think what I'll do is I'll ramble a little bit to set the scope, and then you could react to it and see where we go from there.
Yeah.
I noticed, I think, an asymmetry in dialogues between, let's say, Christians or Catholics like me, and then agnostics and atheists. Because I had a lot of agnostic friends in college, and the asymmetry is over just basic intuitions for what someone else is saying. Someone on the other side, can I put myself in their shoes and understand them in their own words, from their perspective? Can I articulate to them what they believe to their satisfaction? And I think the asymmetry is it's very easy for a Christian like me to articulate to the atheist why he's an atheist. In his own words, I just don't see any evidence. I think that's the words they use that come out of their mouth, but I think that also accurately captures what they believe, which is I just have a scientific frame. And I think this is for just, intelligent people who are scientifically minded who genuinely don't believe in God. Like, I'm just kind of assuming the best here, the kind of basic scenario. I think they just have a scientific frame of mind, and they don't see any scientific evidence for the existence of God. That's not a scientific concept. And I think that's just basically what they believe. And I think the asymmetry is, I've never really heard an atheist give a good description to a Christian. Why does the Christian believe what they do? To the Christian's satisfaction. Can you describe to me why I'm Catholic to my satisfaction? And I've never really, I can't say never, but it's like I almost never hear a good, profound insight from the atheist as to why I believe what I do. And I think that's the asymmetry in conversation.
Yeah.
You're going to react to something there.
Yeah, I feel like there's a difference, because there's some atheists, like Sam Harris types, who are extremely intelligent about why they're atheists and how they are viewing the world and stuff. And I myself don't know Sam Harris at all, really.
Yeah.
And I assume he's a generally intelligent person, so I assume when he talks about his atheistic viewpoint, he's not being naive about a theistic understanding of the universe.
If we're going to talk about Sam, because I've listened to a lot of his podcasts, and actually I would say he's one of the people who I think would give one of the best, most generous accounts. He went on a ramble in one of his podcasts about like why someone might join ISIS. And it was like, he was putting it in the most, I don't want to say positive light, but in the most like, I understand what kind of life story would get you there. And I think he put it in a way that's like, oh, I could see that life story happening. And I think he put it in very, understanding terms. I think that's the right way to put it. Not that he's saying it's a good thing, but he's understanding what a life story might be that'll get someone there.
Yeah.
And I think he was one of the few people who might actually be able to articulate that.
It's funny, because I've never actually seen that podcast or whatever where he was discussing that. But I've had discussions with some of my own personal friends where it's like, oh yeah, I could totally understand, like, if I was a very fundamentalist Muslim and I heard there was this jihad going on in another part of the world and it's this moralistic crusade for my beliefs, etc., why I might feel, oh, hey, this is something that's a reasonable, like a thing within reason for me to want to support or potentially join myself. Although, albeit, within that mindset, that's how you would view that as something, as a good thing, whereas from our mindsets, and generally in most people in Western civilization, we view it as an abominable thing.
Yeah.
I think. And I think that's kind of the crux of what we wanted to talk about here today, is mindsets and kind of breaking them and being able to at least put ourselves temporarily into another mindset to understand what's going on.
Yeah, and to be clear, there's a time and a place for dialogue, and there's a time and a place where you just gotta fight. Where when it comes to terrorism, it's like, we have to stop this from happening, so we're going to fight terrorists. We're not going to engage in dialogue and try to understand where they're coming from. Some people just got to you have to stop their actions from happening.
Yeah.
But, so, what we're talking about, I think, is the kind of normal case where you're just in college meeting people you disagree with on the other side with different experiences and different worldviews, and trying to get into someone else's frame. And so, yeah, I think what you're getting at is like, how can we, if you're in, I think there's something about a genuine dialogue where that's kind of one of the rules, is I'm genuinely going to try to get into your frame of mind when I'm talking to you. That's just how I'm going to understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
And so how can we help people when you're in this genuine dialogue, because a lot of these genuine dialogues happen, how do I help someone get into my frame?
Yeah, I think was it Aristotle or some Greek guy who was really famous that had a quote which was along the lines of a a truly wise or intelligent person can entertain a notion without necessarily fully believing it. So the idea of being able to entertain a notion of someone's mindset and worldview without necessarily wholeheartedly believing it.
Not only that, I want to entertain the strongest representation of their idea.
Exactly.
I don't want to, because I really, if I'm really trying to get at the truth, I want to grapple with the best ideas and select from them. You know, I don't want to just come in with my preconceptions and try to come away with my same preconceptions. If I want to actually go and grapple with the best ideas around so I can claim them for myself. You know, and I think that's kind of what's happening underneath a genuine good dialogue between people who mean well, is you're going to try to understand the different experiences and the different ideas that are in play.
Yeah, definitely, and especially now, I think that's a very vital thing to have now, because we're living in this kind of culture now, which is like, if it's especially common now, where if someone doesn't ascribe to our ideology, it's very common where people will have this idea of, oh, because you don't ascribe to my ideology, you are my enemy, and you are objectively wrong, and not only wrong, you are evil for having that notion, regardless of what your ideology may or may not be.
And I think the result is, in this culture, there is a genuine thirst for good conversations.
Yes.
And I think that's why there's a market for podcasts.
Yeah.
Because you could sit down and just unpack what someone thinks. And there's a market for just genuine dialogue. And so when the kind of more to the point, 'cause I think that's a good intro, more to the point is when these good conversations do inevitably happen, because you're going to meet a lot of people who they'll just talk to you, you know? Like, this is a thing that'll happen, believe it or not.
Yeah, and there's some objective proof to that statement, because the Joe Rogan podcast, if I'm correct, is currently the #1 podcast in the entire world.
I actually looked at, Stephen Colbert, how many views he gets in a week. Joe Rogan gets in a day.
Yeah.
It's that much of a difference.
Yeah, Joe Rogan is massive, and what he literally does is exactly what we're talking about, which is just, okay, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to talk with you, I'm going to try to understand what you're about. And this could be from varying, it doesn't even have to be from like a religious or political mindset. Sometimes it's just something more like an artistic musical mindset, where you'll have like a musician down and try to understand their perspective of art and creativity and music. So
I think when the trick for us is to break the asymmetry, which is, I think it's when, because I'm coming from a place of I've had a lot of these good dialogues with people, and so I'm kind of trying to draw from that. It's like, all right, when we're having these good conversations, I think the materialist it can easily draw people into their frame. It's very intuitive why a materialist is a materialist. I think when you have enough of these discussions, I think you can pretty much understand where they're coming from. On the other hand, if you've had a lot of conversations with Christians, you could come away not really understanding why people are Christian. I think that's possible.
Yeah, definitely. If you're not aware of the framework in which a lot of our ideas are built upon, it's kind of hard to even understand why those views are being held.
Yeah. And
that's kind of the core of what we're trying to talk about today, which is materialism versus non-materialism in terms of your, particularly in our case, we're talking about religion, but it goes beyond that to even philosophical mindset.
And I want to make a distinction here. There's materialism versus just non-materialism versus Christianity. So like, one discussion we could have is, how do we break out of a materialist mindset? How can we help someone? If someone thinks materialism is just really intuitive, is there a counter intuition that we could just break out of that? Versus there's a Christian intuition in particular, which is what's the vision of Christianity that's playing in my head that I find intuitive, that I map onto the world. And I think those are two different discussions.
Yeah.
And I think for me, it's almost more, I'm really curious about both of them. And maybe let's start, I don't know if you have a reaction to that first.
One idea I was just kind of thinking about is, I heard a quote on one of my favorite podcasts recently, which is, a lot of times, this guy was talking about ghosts, but it was like, when to get someone to even entertain the notion that's, like, in his case, ghosts were real, most people they want a ghost in a cage. They want I find that a lot of materialists, they want this notion of, okay, I want some sense of objective proof within my frame of reference, within this materialist frame of reference, that can prove it wrong. So the idea is like, okay, if I don't believe in ghosts and you suddenly hand me a cage with a ghost inside, I can suddenly see, oh, the people who believed in ghosts were right all along. That my viewpoint was wrong, and I am now open to change. Whereas I find that that's not something that is a practical thing that can happen. Especially when we're talking about materialism versus non-materialism, where you can't just put a non-material thing into a material cage to prove materialism wrong. You have to you have to enter a more abstract line of thinking and try to, as we've been talking about, break out of the materialist confines of the train of thought to grasp what's going on, rather than forcing your perception, the outside perception, into your own.
Actually, I have two reactions to that. One is, I think it's harder than putting a ghost in a box, almost. But it's, on the one hand it's harder, on the one hand it's easier. I think it's harder because it's like, when a materialist says, like, show me something that's not material, that's almost a leading question, because all things are material things by definition. So if I can show you something like an object, it's always going to be a material thing. So I can't show you an object that's gonna break you out of that way of thinking. It's just by definition. So if you can't show someone an object of something, that's kind of the hard problem. And when I say it's easier, I actually don't think it requires more abstraction or more abstract thoughts. And the reason is because when we use non-scientific language to describe everyday experiences, I don't think it's more abstract than scientific abstractions. And here's an example of what I mean. Like, if you're talking about, like, basic ethics, like, I don't know, do look both ways when you cross the street. It's right. There's a moral, you're saying, you're talking about how someone should live. And the reason I say that's non-scientific is because it's just, try phrasing that in a scientific way. It's like, look both ways when you cross the street. What's the scientific way of phrasing that?
Yeah.
Which is, there's things called streets which are made of this material, and there's things called cars which have this mass and travel at that speed. And look both ways, you're talking about a mechanical motion of your neck, and you're talking about look both ways in your car. You're looking out for these certain objects that are traveling at a certain speed in these situations, so you can, exercise locomotion in that direction across the street. And, like, a properly scientific description of that scenario is so clunky that it's never really going to be used. Now, it's easy to see, and this kind of goes back to why materialism is intuitive. It's like, you can describe that situation materially, but when you talk about how to live and just basic actions, it's just, there's layers of abstractions. Like, I have an abstraction in my head called cars, and I have another abstraction called roads. Really, if you want to go down a material road, it's atoms and molecules. Look out for these kinds of configurations of atoms, and look at when you're crossing this kind of configuration of atoms, and do this specific kind of motion, which configure your own atoms in this way. When you're, it's so clunky when you're talking about atoms that we talk about abstractions like cars and roads, and turning your head and looking out for things, and we're just describing experiences very neatly and compactly when we're allowed to use these abstractions.
Yes, I I definitely think that's true. And what happened basically when you say look both ways before you cross the street, there's an incredibly large amount of information and meaning encompassed by that simple phrase.
Yeah.
Because it is an abstraction of a lot of different things going on. And my thesis when I was thinking about this topic was effectively the idea that information is magic in its own weird way. So when we can talk about things in terms of atoms and energy, that's basically if you really wanted to decompose the entire universe into a truly materialistic place, you would define everything in terms of mass and energy effectively. You can go all the way down to, quarks and gluons and bosons and whatever. But the whole point is that there is that clunkiness there with that. And also, this doesn't grasp the whole picture. And furthermore, this is an arbitrary nature to the way our universe is built. And we have objective notions of information that feel irrespective of how our universe is built. So, a street isn't just a specific organization of atoms. Streets can be many different things, but they can all be streets. And the ability...
So many different configurations of atoms can all be considered streets.
Exactly. Yeah. So you can have a cobblestone street, or you can have an asphalt street, or you can have a dirt street. But we ascribe all of those to the concept of streets.
Right.
And this goes into what I believe it was Aristotle was talking about way back when, which is forms. Where the idea of the concept of a street is an immaterial, ephemeral thing that is not perfectly represented within a materialistic framework. So, for example, if all of humanity were gone, would a street still be a street? And the answer is kinda. And that's where I think the thing is, where things get interesting. Where if in a truly materialistic mindset, you kind of have to divorce humanity from the entire equation. Because when
everything loses its meaning, is it still the same?
Exactly. If a tree falls down in the forest, does it make a sound? So the idea is, when a tree falls in a forest, it creates vibrations in the air, in the atoms, etc.
But is it noisy?
Exactly. That's just an arbitrary thing. But we ascribe this ephemeral meaning to that.
Yeah, and building off this, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think there's an Aristotelian sort of world of forms, or is it Plato or Aristotle who is the forms?
I don't remember.
I think it's Aristotle.
Someone listening to this is thinking, these scrubs,
Yeah,
they don't know their Greek thinkers.
I'm going to get this wrong. I'm going to guess Aristotle, and that's going to be wrong. So I'm going to flip the coin. It's going to be the wrong one. But I think the traditional way that I've understood it, not a professional philosopher here, but the way I've understood the classical argument is that when you have these abstraction of like a street, right? Like you were saying, there's so many different configurations of atoms that can be considered streets. So we just have this neat abstraction for it, and it's it's a street or a tree, right? Every tree is different, but somehow we know how to label it tree. So the classical argument is there is a immaterial form of a tree, which kind of you see manifestations of it, and it's a sort of metaphysical tree with manifestations. And to Plato, or I feel like Plato is the right answer. Like, as I'm talking about this, I feel like it's Plato. But to the ancient thinker, it would be the form that's the most real thing, right? And I can almost come to a very similar non-materialist conclusion without forms and immaterial substances, because I think substance is, I don't like that word, because when you think of form as the substance of tree, or the form of the tree, it's substance isn't the right word, because that almost sounds like a physical thing you can measure. What I kind of want to gravitate towards instead is...
Actually, I want to jump in here. Yeah. You can't measure how tree something is. But things have varying degrees of being trees. So, yes. And that's a very, I think, powerful notion there, where it's like, okay, that's a tree. But there's no way for me to physically measure how tree that tree is. Like, okay, that's a bush, but in a way it's kind of a tree? Is it like 5 units of tree on our arbitrary materialist scale here? Because like temperature is something you can objectively measure about something, but you can't measure its being of a tree. That's right. That's ephemeral.
Yeah, but I think there's something about that language that turned me off. That kind of turns me off, because when you say there's the form, the world of forms, it's like there's something inaccessible about that. There's something about that where the rubber doesn't hit the road. It's almost like you can teach an AI to recognize trees by telling it whether it's right or wrong, but the AI doesn't live in a world of forms. It lives in a world of statistics, where it's like, how do I not get punished? If I see a picture and I guess it right, how do I get the social feedback that affirms my statement that it's a tree? It's like, it's a tree, and I'm going to get that right 99.99% of the time because of social feedback saying, everyone else agreeing that, yeah, that's a tree, right? Where's the form? So the way I want to, I don't know if you have a reaction, but I have a way of reframing this, which gets to where we want to be without really forms, which is thinking about things in terms of complexity. So if you want to think about, humans live on the most complicated level of the universe. Like, if you look at really, really small things, you can describe their behavior in a few equations. Like subatomic particles, there's a few equations that describe their behavior. And when you smash them together and you make atoms, there's a lot of different kinds of atoms out there. But then, how many different ways can you configure atoms together? So again, kind of going levels of complexity higher. There's different millions of ways you could arrange molecules, and then bajillions of ways you could arrange all the different molecules. And so humans are at the highest level of complexity, because then when you start getting higher, it's like, how does the Earth behave? It's like, again, we're kind of going back to a few equations.
So I have a...
We're at the peak of complexity, and we have to navigate that level of things.
So you gave me kind of an aha moment there, where I'm an engineer, and I deal a lot with raw concepts of data and information. And when you think in terms of, in engineering we call this communication, where you have, let's say, digits. So let's say I have 5 digits that can be 0 and 1. That's 5 things, but they can, within them, they can contain information that is 2 to the 5th power of complexity. Mm-hmm. Because... And
there's an operation for combining them.
The idea is that there's 5 material objects there, basically zeros and ones, which can be, that's an abstraction, but it can be like, a light that's on or off, or, in the most raw sense in our material reality right now, at least right now, is like an electron in one state versus another. But the thing is the information contained in that can be significantly higher than the amount of material objects in there. So one electron can have a certain amount of information inside of it, but once you start adding more to that, you create an order, which then contains more information, which is stored within that, but that's not a material thing in itself. It is data in itself is immaterial, and therefore it is beyond kind of the electrons themselves. So
I have
in the materialist like mindset, in a material kind of universe, you just kind of view those as 5 electrons. But because we have this immaterial way of abstracting things, we can assign more meaning to those 5 electrons than is actually within those 5 electrons.
Because there's 2 to the 5th possible configurations of them. When they line up in this configuration, we can ascribe a meaning to that.
Exactly.
So I have almost a parallel thought that kind of came here, which is when you have, simple things adding up together like Legos. How many different configurations of Legos are there, right? It's almost another way of thinking about it. But we're in a world where we're built, we're in a world of Lego contraptions, not Legos. We're in the world of these conglomerates of atoms, not the world of atoms themselves. And so we have to deal with a whole level of complexity. And so think about, just to stay within physics for a second, Newton, I shouldn't say Newtonian physics, I should say classical mechanics is wrong in the sense that the world is not made of point masses colliding with each other. That is not how things behave at the lowest level. That's not really how reality operates. You'd have to go to Maxwell's equations and the Schrodinger equation and throw in some Einstein and somehow to get, let's say we can get that to work with quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
But point being is point masses interacting with each other is not how the world works. However, classical mechanics is point masses. Most civil engineers, most mechanical engineers don't know a lick of quantum mechanics. Just don't understand it. And these are the guys building bridges and cranes and submarines and buildings. Like, they have a low resolution view. They understand the classical mechanics and they know how to apply them. But you don't have to understand to that level of resolution how reality actually is in order to build all these things successfully. That's what I mean by complexity, which is we can get by with a sort of low resolution view of things. It's a clunky framework that's actually wrong. It's actually not true, but it's close enough where we can describe things in a certain way that just kind of makes sense to us. Like, I'm going to put a label, this configuration of atoms here, this is a cup, right? Mm. And I know what to do with cups, right? How many different configurations of atoms are cups? Like, no, let's not think about it that way. This is a cup because it holds liquid.
Yeah.
Right? What's a liquid? I don't want to think about that. I don't want to think too hard about it. It just splashes back and forth, right?
Yeah.
Don't think about it too hard, right? It's this. We live in a low resolution world of these descriptions which are wrong.
Yes.
Because we're in such a complicated level of nature. And I think it's because it's complicated, because we live in a world of these. There's so many different configurations that could happen at our level of experience that we have to organize things crudely. I think that's the best way I could put it right now. But there's so many different kinds of cups that I just have to have a word for a cup, and I have to be close enough where I have to have a sloppy word called cup to describe these different configurations of atoms.
Yes. However, I just wanted to add one thing to that. Oftentimes, our abstractions aren't wrong. They can be correct. And I think Vsauce has a great video on YouTube called Causes versus Effects, where he talks about centripetal force and rotation and things like that. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but the notion is that even in science, we have these laws that we can abstract the physics of a situation, but that's not the laws perfectly describe what's going on, but they aren't causing the thing to happen.
Yes.
So just because we have an abstraction does not necessarily mean it is fundamentally wrong. It does not perfectly describe what is happening.
I think that's perfect. That's the key, which is we have descriptions of what happens. And we have useful descriptions. Like, my description of the world lets me navigate it.
Exactly.
Where I can talk about the world well enough to navigate it. Where if I had to talk about the world in terms of what it really is, and let's say if you're a materialist, let's just roll with this for a second. If I had to actually describe the world in terms of, atoms and molecules and their various reconfigurations, I wouldn't be able to get by. I have to be able to talk about cups and roads and anger and emotion and relationships and finding purpose in life, and I have to be able to talk about all these all these configurations. Like, a cup is a configuration, and there's many, but it's a sloppy word for something that I know what to do with. Like, here's a thing and I know what to do with it. I think that's part of language.
Yeah, definitely. And see, where I'm at right now is I'm kind of like, okay, we're having this great discussion about how you can't really work with the universe with like perfectly accurate descriptions of things. You have to make abstractions. But my question is, how do we get from that to describing the world from almost a more theistic or supernatural
right.
language or vision of things?
Yeah, and so what I said at the beginning was there's two conversations we can have. One is pick your theology. How do I begin to think? How do I come to think about the world in terms of a specific theological language? Mm-hmm. Then there's the other one is how do I break out of a materialist worldview? So think about the way I would think about this. This is just the way I'm thinking about it right now, which is to go back to the physics example of classical mechanics. Classical mechanics is a sort of description of reality. Like, you're making an assumption when you're calculating, where to put the counterweight on your crane. You're assuming that the crane is a couple of point masses, and which is not true, but you're using these point masses to understand how the crane behaves, so you know where to put certain things, where you know where to put the screws and the nuts and the bolts, you know how long to make the beams, and you know where to put the concrete, right? But that's not how reality actually works. So the point there is you can have a set of physical principles which doesn't reduce to the actual physical reality underneath.
Yes, I agree.
And the reason is because you're dealing with when you're in the most complicated level of things, like at the the human level of experience, which is the most complicated level of configurations of things. You have to have just ways of describing it that allow you to navigate it. So you're going to have low resolution images that don't reduce to physics. Not only that, it's so extreme that physical principles don't reduce to other physical principles. Like you have classical mechanics, which is just a low resolution thing. It's just a low resolution way of describing things. So why would you assume that all of your language games that you have reduce to materialism? That's maybe I could have led into that a little bit better.
Yeah. Like my perspective right now is like, yes, what you're saying is all true, but my question is, how do we move on from that? Because the perspective is like, okay, we can acknowledge that the language we use and the ideas we have do not like reduce to a truly materialist place. But now how do we expand on that to the point of why is our language and our abstraction relevant to a non-materialistic mindset? And I think that's where you have to get into the concept of meaning.
Well, I think before you even ask that, there's another question you could ask, which is why would we assume that our language games do reduce to materialism? So before you even say what do they reduce to, it's like, why would we pick materialism arbitrarily and say that all our valid language games just reduce to materialism? So let me phrase that a little bit more formally. So maybe this is the part where we try to break out of materialism. Let me just take a minute and just lay it out more philosophically here. Not that I'm a philosopher, but
we're all best philosophers here.
After a cigar and a drink, right?
Exactly.
Maybe to lay it out as formally as I can, you could ask the question, what kind of thing is physics? And then, are there other kinds of things like it? And if there are other kinds of things like it, then there goes materialism. Because materialism is basically everything is physics. So if you could say, what's the game of physics? Then you could also ask, are there other games like it? And there goes your... it doesn't tell you what's out there, maybe, but maybe it tells you that there's non-physical games.
Yes.
Maybe to lay this out, if you ask what is physics, it's throwing math at nature until you get equations that hold.
Yes.
And generally. So to kind of lay it out a little bit more rigorously, I'm gonna take the language of mathematics and go out into nature and make observations, and I'm gonna describe those observations in the language of math, and then I'm gonna try and come up with the most general mathematical statements which apply. And then I'm gonna try and come up with some general statements, and I'm gonna try to come up with specific mathematical statements which apply to this situation. But what you're really doing is you're making an assumption about reality, which is I can describe it mathematically.
Yes.
Which is nature is quantifiable.
Yeah.
And then you're developing that language. You're developing your mathematics. And then you're going out and making mathematical statements which are true. Like you're going out into nature and you're seeing, hey, which of these statements are actually applicable to nature and to my observations. And that's the game. Is you make an assumption about reality. So this is physics.
Yes.
You make an assumption about reality that nature is quantifiable. I'm shaking the table here. Mm-hmm. You make an assumption about reality, which is nature is quantifiable. You develop a language in the natural vocabulary of that assumption. So if I'm going to assume that reality is quantifiable, what's the language of quantities? It's math. Yeah. Then I'm going to go apply that language to nature and make a bunch of true statements in that language.
Yes. But see, I think the most important thing that you're talking about here, I think, is the fact that the language can encompass nature, but the language is not nature. And I think that's the more interesting notion there. Because with physics, we're using effectively our language, which is math and meaning, to describe what is happening in nature.
Yeah. But
the thing is that information, that language, is beyond nature in its own right. And that's my thesis, which I said earlier. Which
maybe unnatural is a word.
Information is magic. It's not nature. It's not. Information is not truly quantifiable. I mean, like, you can quantify like bits and like ones and zeros, but the meaning associated with that is immaterial, ephemeral, and not nature. So when even numbers, like, we can do math.
Numbers exist, right?
Yeah, like, we can do math with the concept of infinity, but infinity, as far as we know, does not exist anywhere in nature. Theoretically, at least within our current materialistic mindset, the universe is finite to at least a certain degree. I think the only thing that's infinite, as far as we know, is time and space. But even those are abstract concepts that are not composed of like atoms, And we don't necessarily know if there's a boundary to the universe. We just assume right now that there isn't.
Yeah.
And that's kind of my point there is once you start the ascribing of meaning to nature is where suddenly you have to break out of a materialist mindset.
Yeah.
Because like kind of how we were talking about before with like when a tree falls in this forest, does it make a sound? When, look both ways when you're crossing the street. Like, there is a physics and nature behind all of the phenomena in reality. But the thing is the meanings associated with that are infinite and beyond nature. Mm. So, for example, the concept, the thing, I made a great rant earlier, which is, your dog is a sorcerer. Because your dog, when he pisses on a couch, he's performing a ritual where he's prescribing that material natural object to the ephemeral concept of what is owned by him. And furthermore is cementing that as his territory. The concept of that dog's ownership is not material or describable in a natural physics mindset. We've
made up a concept and decided that concept is I can't say decided, but we recognize that concept is real.
Exactly.
It's the dog's property, but what does that really mean? Physically, it's nothing, but it's a concept that we see it. We have this intuition that it's real.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what I say makes pretty much, if you can ascribe meaning to an object that is not directly a result, directly describable by its physics, that is sorcery. That's my kind of thesis.
Yeah, I like the word. Actually, you brought up a really good point that I wasn't originally thinking about, but when I kind of said, when we try to lay this out formally, when I said, look, you make an assumption about reality, you develop a language using the natural vocabulary of those assumptions, and then you just apply that vocabulary to the world and make statements about it, which are true, in that language. Mm-hmm. So in physics, it's make an assumption about reality, it's quantifiable, develop a language of quantities, math,
exactly,
and then make statements which are mathematically true.
Yes.
So kind of a 3-step process. What you said was step 2. Step 2 is just you were looking at step 2 and says, well, that's really just a description using our own language that we kind of made up to talk about the world using these assumptions.
Yeah. And furthermore, another thing that's interesting is we can fathom things that are not true. So we can create fake things in our minds that aren't real.
Even fake mathematical frameworks.
Yes, so...
which are internally consistent but don't really apply to
yeah, if you want to have some fun and you're really good at math, look up a Galois field.
How do you spell that?
I think it's Galois field. A field like, football field. And it's basically an internally consistent mathematical framework. So this is used in the field of communications, where basically you don't want to, when you have computer chips, you don't want to encompass infinity numbers within your mathematical framework for your computer device. You have only this many bits, so you want to be able to describe as much information as possible in a mathematically consistent way so your machine works. And the point is that the world is that machine. The world has an internally consistent mathematical framework and work. But we, as humans, can fathom things, other internally consistent things that do not exist. And I think that is a sorcery in itself. That is, I want to avoid going too much into Christianity and Christian theology because we're trying to just first break out of materialism before we even get there. But the notion of Christianity saying we are made in the likeness of God is because we are capable of creating. And The idea is in our minds, we can create abstractions and ideas and meaning that are beyond what is just nature. So, like, a human being can create a song, and that song is very specific and may have never existed in nature before. But that doesn't mean that song could not exist. But we can also theoretically create songs that we can fathom of songs that cannot exist. Mm-hmm. Even though we cannot, it may be difficult for us to describe it within our mindsets, but through different tools, especially math, we can create things that don't exist. It's a really weird, abstract way of thinking, but it's true. Like we're not trapped in nature is the point that I'm trying to make. We're not trapped into everything has to be like nature. We can fathom of ways that nature is not but could be.
Well, maybe another way of saying a more punchy version is, well, we can come up with mathematical systems which don't apply to the world. So when we find a mathematical description of the world which does seem to apply to the world, is that just a description? And that's not really what the world is. That's a description of the world that we can make sense of.
Exactly.
Here, another way of putting it. So you were kind of talking about step 2. So if the 3 steps are, I just kind of want to keep wrapping it into this formal way of talking about things, just to keep track of the conversation.
Yeah, this is incredibly abstract conversation, so it's important to ground things.
If physics is 3 steps, it's step 1, make assumptions about reality. It's quantifiable. Step 2 is develop a language in the vocabulary of that assumption. So develop a language of quantities is math. And then 3 is apply that language to the world and see how many true statements you can come up with. And your description of reality is only... Let me say that another way. Your understanding of reality is only as good as your assumptions. So we kind of set out assuming that the world is a bunch of interacting quantities smashing into each other. It's this much energy turning into this, this much kinetic energy turning into that much potential energy. It's transfer of these quantities of this mass, of this velocity, right? It's a bunch of interacting quantities. And, if the universe is just a unity interacting with itself, then maybe quantities aren't the best way of talking about it. So we can question the assumptions, and then we could also question whether or not mathematics tells us what the universe is. And this is actually a point I think Bertrand Russell made, which was mathematics. If we have a mathematical description of things, it's exactly that. It's a description. Here's the other, for me, the kicker, and it's not obvious why it's a kicker at first, but for me the kicker is that physical principles don't reduce to other physical principles. So I think if you, in step 3, which is, we have our vocabulary, we've made our assumptions about how the world is, and we've developed a vocabulary. Now as we're developing principles in that vocabulary, it's like when we do physics, physical principles don't reduce to other physical principles. Like Maxwell's equations don't reduce to Schrödinger equations. Like classical physics is actually incompatible with with quantum mechanics in a sense.
But both of those methods work. They work even though they don't
they work in their own scopes.
Yes.
So for example, if you're building a crane, you're not going to use Maxwell's equations.
Yeah.
It doesn't contradict Maxwell's equations, which are charged fields, electromagnetic fields.
Yeah, you don't have to deal with. You generally don't have to deal with the gravity of each individual atom of the crane interacting with each other.
General relativity and
yeah.
So it doesn't contradict those equations, but those equations don't tell us anything interesting about how a crane behaves at the level of the crane.
Yeah.
It might tell us how the atoms within the crane operate, but it doesn't tell us anything about the crane at the level of the crane. And that's what I mean when I say when humans are at the most complicated level is we describe systems in a useful way in their own language. So I want to talk about humans at the level of the human. I want to talk about cranes at the level of the crane, which means it doesn't turn into Maxwell. I use a classical framework to do that.
Yeah.
Because that's just what I need to get by. So my point is, my first point is, if just within physics, physical principles don't reduce to other physical principles. So if you want to argue that the whole world is material, it's all your valid language games. So let's say you're in the business of talking about the world and just making observations and describing your experiences with words, just describing the whole gambit of the human experience. What's everything there is to experience as a human? Let's say I could describe all of it, just in the most natural, fluent vocabulary that I have. It's like, and then let's find patterns in the human experience. Materialism assumes that all those patterns reduce to physics. And the kicker for me is physical principles don't reduce to other physical principles, even within the physical paradigm.
So why would you think that would all reduce to the human element would reduce to physics?
Yes. So everything
if physics doesn't reduce to physics.
And here's the other kicker. Let's question. So that's questioning it at level 2. What if we question the very first step? Make the assumption about reality. So if we imagine the whole gambit of human experience, what's everything there is to experience, and let's say I could talk about it fluently in a way that I can understand you when you talk about, let's say if you were to lay out all of your experiences to me in a way that I can understand, right? The words you use somehow make sense to me, and I'm trying to determine the patterns of your experience. Some of that is going to be just naturally reducible to physics. Some of that is.
Yeah.
Some of that you're going to be talking about life and relationships and finding purpose, and there's just different language games. So let's just take ethics. So let's start out. What's your 3-step process for ethics? I'm going to make an assumption about reality, which is humans have ethical obligations towards each other, right? Or humans have ethical obligations. So then develop a language in the natural vocabulary of that assumption. So if my assumption is humans have ethical obligations, the vocabulary I develop is going to be good, bad, right, wrong, better, worse, guilty, innocent. I'm going to develop this language. And then I'm going to go out into the world, make observations with those glasses on, with the moral glasses on. I'm going to view the world through a moral lens and make moral statements about things. A lot of stuff is just morally neutral. Sometimes something good happened, or you did something right, you did something wrong.
Yeah, and
right?
Even the core concept of good is built upon an abstraction of our human experience. We have we observe the human experience of reality, and we've defined certain concepts as good or bad based on our understanding of humanity and our experience.
And it's necessarily an abstraction because we're in the most complicated realm of being.
Exactly.
And when you develop a language game around a separate set of assumptions other than the universe is quantifiable, that's a different set of assumptions than humans have moral obligations. Mm-hmm. So you're going to develop different language games, and you're going to develop different principles to encapsulate those sets of experiences. So there you go. We're governed by complementary but different principles.
Yes.
And that's why the kicker for me is physical principles don't reduce to other physical principles.
Yeah,
so we're questioning it at step 2, but what if we just make different assumptions about what if we use a different vocabulary for our experiences entirely? We're going to develop different language games and therefore different underlying principles. Like the moral language, we're talking about categorical imperatives and natural laws, and it's just a totally different universe.
Yeah.
Not really. It's a complementary, but it's just a different world than Schrodinger equations and Maxwell equations.
Exactly, and it's foolish to think that would reduce to physics, even if physics itself doesn't reduce to other physics.
Physics doesn't reduce to other physics, and you're only doing a description of reality, not stating the reality itself.
Yeah.
So when you compound those 2 points, I think that's where you could start to break out of a materialist way of thinking.
Yes. And from there, you could start thinking about things within that language of complexity, within the sort of, okay, we're not talking about physics anymore. We're talking about like humanity and like morals and ethics and all that. And you could start thinking about, okay, how does meaning like translate through things? And you can almost start taking a kind of scientific mindset to how ethics and morality and stuff works. Where if you can define certain things as good, how do things translate relate with that? What are different laws and relationships between different moral and ethical concepts?
So this was a lot, and I want to see if we could close the loop on. I think we've kind of broken out of materialism, and I think me and you are on the same page.
Yes.
Can we like close the loop on this? Like, how do we condense all that into? Not even a meme, just what's the paragraph version of it? Because I think we tied together concepts like complexity, and we tied together concepts of, physics describes the world, it doesn't describe what it is. And we've tied together these concepts, and that's kind of enough to break out of it. But how do we get there if we stop and think about it? And
see, I don't know if there is a really I think I would say like higher forms of order do not what's it called, reduce to lower forms of order, I would argue. But at the same time, that's not really like something that can be packaged in a very simple way.
Yeah.
If I had to,
I think the philosophical way of putting it would be the human level of complexity warrants separate ways of describing the set of all experiences. So like the human level of experiencing things is so diverse and complex that when we try and describe it, we inevitably come up with different language games for different areas of the human experience.
Yeah,
which
reality
reduce to different descriptions of things, which reduce to different principles governing them.
I think the reality of human experience requires separate scientific equations that do not reduce to physical equations. That's kind of how I would describe it. When you're describing humanity and the human experience, you need a language for that, and that does not reduce to physics, which also does not reduce into other physics. Everything requires its own unique language and perspective.
Yeah, and I think for me, I think for me to answer the philosophical questions that come after this, what like you were getting at, like how do we talk about reality if not in a material way? For me, the intermediate step, which I think we're at now, is how do you categorize the different experiences we have? Like what are the categories of human experience? Not to answer this because I don't know how to do it, but like if we talk about the material world, that's a category of that's the natural language for a certain category of experiences.
Exactly.
So the natural world of here's a hard table, here's a wet drink. There's a physics and physicalism is just a natural language for a certain set of human experiences. And there's another set of human experiences, and there's some overlap, like ethics. Like, how do I live? What's right and wrong? Because how do I capture that set of intuitions and experiences with a language game? I'm going to use ethics. And then there's navigating the interior life. Like I'm a subject in my head. I'm conscious. I have experiences. I feel certain feelings. How do I navigate and describe these things? I'm going to develop a language game for that. And I want to live a purposeful life, and I want to live a happy life. Yeah. Those are even two more different. Like, how do I find purpose in life? Right? There's a set of experiences that we describe with the language of purpose. and maybe there's patterns to living a purposeful life, and there's happiness, and it's like, how do I live? How would I live what I would call a happy life? And it's like there's a language game that you would employ. There's vocabulary of happiness, and you could describe situations in terms of that. And it's like there's so many different categories of human experience, and the natural language for those different categories is all different. Yeah. And so you're going to make in any given set of experiences, you're going to employ a different language game.
Yes.
And you have to come up with patterns to talk about it, like to understand it in that language.
Yeah, and I think what's
it's
also
so obvious that it's not going to reduce to physical descriptions.
Yeah, and I think what's also extremely important is that all of this matters. It's very easy to think like, okay, well, for example, we're talking about happiness here. So if I were to be kind of naive, I could say, oh, well, that's just your dopamine and chemicals in your brain telling you you're happy and pleasured. So now I know what to do to live a happy life. Thank you for that. Thank you for that information. Exactly. I can just pump chemicals into my brain and feel happy.
Yeah.
But the thing is, like, it really matters because the way that your brain works, like, I mean, to some extent, I don't know what would happen if you just took someone and just artificially pumped their brain full of dopamine and serotonin.
Yeah.
Would they just be like, oh, wow, this is really nice. Just, like, keep me plugged into the machine forever. I feel fulfilled in every way. Yeah. But, like, theoretically, if we could synthesize that, like, those chemicals to a perfect way and perfectly, But what's more important, I think, is that this language and these abstractions and this meaning, all of this stuff within this sort of higher degree of complexity really matters because it orchestrates the pretty much the destiny of humanity, where basically the way we understand the world affects how we interact with it, and this circles all the way back to the first things we're talking about, which is okay. I could view like when I say look both ways before you cross the street. To have that rule is useful in maintaining my survival in reality, which is built on abstractions that are furthermore more effective simplifications
to navigate the complexity at the human level.
Yeah, it's like you need this framework to navigate humanity.
Yeah, I like the phrase "human level complexity."
Yeah,
because I think that's such a punchy way of putting it.
Yeah. And from there you can start like going into the things it's funny, when I first was coming into this, I was like, oh, I'm gonna talk about how angels and demons are real because ritual like binds abstract concepts and meaning to physical things, where I can make a totem of something where this object now contains the essence of something, and or like by when someone has like a history, infamy, or like legend behind it, that person lives on immortally beyond the scope of their physical. Their atoms have all dispersed into the universe. That person no longer exists, but their memory is still alive in everyone and still impacting the world, and that's all of that abstraction matters. Like, even like when you think of George Washington is a bunch of atoms that are scattered around his gravesite. You might be breathing in George Washington right now without even knowing it, but his message, his being, has lived beyond him in an immortal way that is not describable by simple, like, physical equations. You need to describe that from a perspective of human complexity within this new framework of language, and even to a degree equations and understanding. And like the word I use in engineering is lemmas, but which it's basically relationships, and that's kind of the point, is like if you neglect those, if you naively say, oh, I don't need to worry about that because everything is deducible to physics, you're neglecting the massive impact of everything that is beyond that within the sphere of human complexity and information of what the human experience is. Like if you just distill that to basic physics and atoms and energy and mass and point masses, then it's kind of, you're missing the bigger picture.
I think you need another drink.
I think I do.
Yeah, so I think another way of putting that is at human level, at the human level complexity. There's so many different kinds of experiences. It's like, what's the natural language for human level complexity? The answer is, we don't really have one. We have a bunch of different language games.
Yeah.
We have to talk about the natural world, and we have to talk about finding purpose and navigating the interior life and relationships and being happy and finding purpose and so many different things, and crossing the street, like,
yeah,
and you know, navigating social responsibilities. It's like it's human level complexity has a bunch of different language games which don't reduce to each other.
Exactly. And
that's the crux for me.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of the human struggle, is all of humanity getting together and saying what languages and understandings of the human complexity are most accurate,
yeah,
and most correct.
Yeah.
And wars are fought over this. People die. Well, people live. People do great things, yeah, as a result of these things, and to deny them is, in my thought, foolish.
Yeah, and you have to balance them too. For example, I think of, you ever see Age of Ultron, the Avengers?
No, I don't watch superhero movies.
It's one of those things where one way to save humanity from suffering is to kill it. It's kind of one of those things where he's living a purposeful life. Has
anyone here ever played the game Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura? One person who did will know what I'm talking about. The villain of that is literally the same thing. Is like, I love the souls of everyone and all living things so much that to end their suffering, I must kill them all.
Well, so now I think we're kind of looking forward to how do we, where does theologies come in?
Yeah.
Which is, we have to balance all these different language games which don't reduce to each other. And so the little syllogism, almost, I can't say it's a syllogism, the thing that I think about is when you take the set of all human experiences, right? Because this is the set of all human experiences is so rich and diverse. Again, purpose, ethics, natural world, interior life, social norms. It's such a diverse range of experiences that don't seem like they resolve into each other necessarily. Yeah. We have to balance them all, and it's how do we integrate them all? And so here's a question: what is the sum total of all human experience? It's a person. That's the one word for it. That's just the sum of all different all possible human experiences. It's a personal reality that we're living in a sense, which is the person is what balances all these separate categories of experience.
Yeah.
It's the person that captures all these things. And so I think when we talk about God, we're talking about the personal reality, which is the sum total of all these different language games is necessarily a personal one. If we try to add them all together into the same reality, we have to start talking about a personal reality.
Yeah.
And I think that's how you segue into theology.
Yeah. And then that's a whole nother argument to have there. That's like a whole thing of exploring how to construct all of that, what the personal experiences relative to each other and putting them all in the same framework. It's incredibly complex, and to close your mind to that, I think, is very blind. I know we were talking about having a meme a while back about this, and I remember a thing a friend of mine said, which was Do you? It wasn't exactly in this form, but it was. Do you really think they built the pyramids because a bunch of chemicals in their brains told them to? Do you really think that that the pyramids were built because they just wanted to? Yeah. The chemicals in their brain were in just the right configuration that they decided to do that.
Yeah, I think
yeah. Do you really think that?
If I had to condense it into a meme, if the atheist meme is I don't see any evidence for God, or the atheist meme is I believe in science over religion, I think the counter meme for me is if you just believe in science, then why don't you only use scientific language to describe your experiences?
Yeah.
I think that's the most condensed that I could make it.
I agree.
How long have we been going?
Yeah, I think we've pretty much got it good. I think it says we're an hour and 11.
I think that's a podcast.
Yeah.
I think I definitely want to talk more about other stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
I think you were the perfect guy to talk about this.
Yeah, definitely. This was fun. Yeah. I didn't even get to talk about demons. I want to talk about demons.